Today, we're going to talk June and July reads. I have all the books I've read in the last 2 months with me here. If you didn't watch my previous video, you would not have heard that I was traveling for the last 2 months. I was in New York at the beginning of June, came home very quickly to Vancouver, and then was in Europe for like 2 months. I know people hate when you just say Europe, but I was in London. I did the Tour de Mont Blanc, was in Geneva for a little bit, and then was with my mom through Greece, Croatia, northern Italy. Everywhere and anywhere, I was there. So anyways, half these books I picked up when I was in London. Obviously, I always do a pretty big book haul when I'm there. However, that made for a very, very heavy suitcase that I had to pay for. So I would say overall it was a pretty good 2 months. I read 17 books total, 9 in June, 8 in July. The bulk of these books are literary fiction. However, there's quite a bit, especially in July. It's almost all translated. There's one nonfiction memoir each month. June, a lot of debuts, which is really exciting. 3 debuts in June. Some reoccurring favorites, a reread, a classic, a little mixed bag of everything. So without further ado, let's jump in. The first book I read in June was very kindly gifted to me by Bloomsbury, and this is a debut set in South Korea in 2008. So amidst, it's set in Seoul amidst the financial crisis of the 2008-2009, and it's called Tailbone. Absolutely gorgeous cover. This was an interesting read. I would probably give it like a solid 3 out of 5 stars. It follows a runaway teen who leaves her family home, runs away to a women's boarding house, and sort of details familial rage, loneliness, toxic relationships of all sorts. I did find it interesting, however, it was quite repetitive with what she was following in the plot, and there was kind of no character growth, I found, for a lot of it. So I did find it repetitive and slow near the end, but I still found it interesting, and with any book that's set somewhere that I have never been, I'm still learning something new. But yeah, so this was an interesting debut to start the month. The next book I read was probably the biggest book of the month. This was a translated fiction I picked up in Paris at Shakespeare & Co. last November. I was really intrigued by the premise on the back, as well as the cover just sort of gave me Call Me By Your Name vibes, if you can't tell. So this is And Their Children After Them. It's a French translated fiction set in 1990s gritty France, like a town sort of near the German border. And I thought this would be sort of a 1990s coming of age, multiple summers, ode to friends and friendship. It is that, more so a fragmented analysis of France in the 90s. I sometimes found the plot kind of dislocated when it was changing character point of views. It was fine. I read it all. Sometimes I was a bit bored. Chapters I really enjoyed, but other parts I'm like, I don't know if this necessarily pertains to the plot. Why am I reading this? So again, not too bad. The next book I read was only book for Pride Month. However, I did read many LGBTQ books in May. Maybe I should have done like an overarching review, but I can review some Pride book recs if you would like, because I do read them all year round. However, the one I read in June was also a debut, and it's a sapphic read, and it is Nymph by Sophia Montrone. This was one of my most anticipated books of the entire year. The whole premise online says it's like a Call Me By Your Name meets Elena Ferrante in a mesmerizing debut set in the northern Italian countryside. 2 of my favorite books, Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet, as well as Call Me By Your Name, northern Italian countryside, one of my favorite places in the entire world. I was so excited for this. Also really funny reading this back to back with Her Children After Them. This isn't really a spoiler, but they both had parts discussing the World Cup in their various timelines, and the World Cup had just started, and it was just something really funny. I was like, if I had a nickel for every time I read about the World Cup in historical fiction back to back, I'd have 2 nickels. Listen, it's not a bad read. It's just my expectations were far too high. I think they could have spent a lot more time on the relationship between the 2 women. There was a lot on the protagonist's relationship with her father, which is fine, but I was hoping for, I guess, more sunburn, and it just wasn't quite that. But gorgeous cover, and you can see the green theme is gonna slowly build. So I read those 2 green covers when I was going to New York. And to complete the green cover trifecta, you'll see. Look at how gorgeous this is, so summery. I read Summer by Edith Wharton. First of all, gorgeous edition. I was actually debating between this one and I think it's the Oxford Modern Classics one. There's so many beautiful editions of this book. However, I love a Penguin Classics find, so I did get this one. Also, I did pick up this postcard of this painting. I forget where I was sometime last year, and so I felt drawn to this cover. So this is a classic set in New England, 1917, and it's about a 17-year-old girl who's trying to escape her life with her hard-drinking adoptive father, and the isolation of her small New England town is like stifling her, and then she kind of spirals. This is like the perfect gateway to summer reading. This was a lot more dramatic and intense than I thought it was going to be. I thought this was going to be like a tee-hee summer read, but her desperation to leave her life and the consequences and the actions she does to leave there. There's not a spoiler where it says, when a young city architect visits for the summer, it offers Charity the chance to break free, but as they embark on an intense affair, will it bring another kind of trap? Anyways, very short, very sweet, sort of the perfect kickoff to summer. I really enjoyed it. I'm glad I read it when I was in New York. I think this is my first Edith Wharton. Recently picked up this one, Ethan Frome, and I liked her writing in this. This is very thin. I'm gonna wait till winter to read that. But yeah, that was great. The next book, I don't have a physical copy. I read it on my Kindle from Vancouver to London. This one, I was just looking for something bingeable, something quick, and arguably that is often a romance for me. I don't really read romance, but this time of year, they sort of come out of the woodwork. And I read Problematic Summer Romance by Ali Hazelwood. I have like very limited recollection of this book, other than why is the male protagonist so stubborn and I want to be in Sicily. It helped me fall asleep, but I finished it on that flight, which is amazing. After that, I took a few days off and I got to London, where I started doing severe damage. Like, I kid you not, bought at least 10 books from various bookshops. It was independent bookshop week when I was in London, so I think I went to like 7 or 8 different independent bookshops. Damage was done. One of the first books I bought and binged while I was in London, the minute I picked it up, was Heart the Lover by Lily King. I had read Writers and Lovers last year or at the beginning of this year. I don't even remember. And it was fine. I was kind of let down by it. Everyone had talked about how much they loved that book. And again, it was one of those like good, not great reads for me. However, Heart the Lover, easy first 5-star read in a long time. I absolutely loved this. I found Lily King's writing just really shone through with this plot. It was a lot more tender and sad than what I thought it was. Well, I knew it was going to be tender and sad, but I just wasn't expecting to cry on the Lizzie line. This was light years better than Writers and Lovers, is my personal opinion. Do I think you need to read Writers and Lovers in order to read this? No, you can totally read this as a standalone. Is it nice to like know some of the interconnected plot points? Sure, but I would 1000% recommend this one. This is so beautiful, and I'm glad I got a paperback, which is why I waited so long to read it, and absolutely loved. Starting to get dark in here, so we're gonna keep a move on. The next book I read was my favorite debut so far this year. I'm probably forgetting other ones I read earlier this year, but definitely my favorite debut of the month. We read this for a book club I have with some 2 of my old coworkers. The 3 of us just like started this to keep in touch, which was really fun because we all live across Canada, and I was the one that picked the book this month, so I'm very glad this lived up to expectations. And that is The Artist by Lucy Steeds. I think in North America it's called The Artist and the Feast. This book is set in Provence, 1920, and so I read this not in Provence, but I did read it in Annecy, and this was absolutely perfect. It was just so colorful and vibrant there. I was actually there during the film festival really randomly. I don't know how this keeps happening to me. I was in, well, Cannes I planned, but I was in Cannes during the Cannes Film Fest. I was now here during the film fest. Just such a vibrant, beautiful town. I could not say enough beautiful things about it. Just like this book. This book was amazing. I think it's commentary on art and artistry and what makes a person great behind the brush. And what is infamy. I I thought about it a lot once I finished this book, and it was just such an interesting concept. I liked the way it was written. It was a very interesting plot. I also just love hearing about art and learning about art, and so just having this interesting perspective and background on artists. I don't know, I was just so pleasantly surprised by this debut. I highly recommend. I have 2 more books for June. The next one, we're gonna keep on the art theme. I read this when I was in Geneva. I wanted to wait until Italy, but I was just too excited to pick it up. This was my nonfiction of the month, and this was recommended by my friend Soph. And this is A Month in Siena by Hisham Matar. This is a little tiny memoir, sort of a vignette of his month in Siena, where he goes and visits really great paintings. He meets local families. I really enjoyed this. I love hearing people's perspectives on art. I love little memoirs that detail certain times in people's lives. This was just kind of like my really ideal nonfiction. I love being immersed in painting and art culture, and this was a very, very gorgeous and short little memoir piece. I really loved how the conversation of art was at the forefront of my reading in June, and it just was a really interesting slice of life, and this was just a little great deep dive into the art in Siena and its history. So I really enjoyed that one as well. The last book I read in June, or I completed in June, I guess, was a reread of a book I read in May. I read it in May, immediately knew I wanted to reread it in June. Why? Because this is The Lovers by Paolo Cognetti. I don't know if I butchered that. This is an Italian translated fiction set in the Italian Alps. So when I read this in May, this had been on my shelf since February. I think I got it in London. And I don't know if I mentioned in this video, but I did do the Tour de Mont Blanc. I hiked that by myself, 10 days with nobody. And so when I read it in May, I knew I wanted to bring this on the hike with me, and I'm so glad I did. This is my Sally Rooney of the Alps. The way this is written and the relationship and the dynamic between the 2 main characters and the people around them working at a refugio, this was simply the most perfect book to bring on that trip. I read it very slowly, only a few pages at a time, and just really immersed in the writing and the descriptions of the Italian Alps and the refugios and the towns, because I was living in it through France, Switzerland, and Italy. So I now read this twice this year, and it's just so tender and so beautiful, and I just really liked it. The other book I started in June, read through July, I'm about 50% of the way, is North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a classic. I've watched and studied the miniseries, the BBC miniseries from 2004 in my English honors class in high school. Absolutely loved it. Arguably better than Pride and Prejudice, my personal take. And so I finally really wanted to get around to the classic. These sort of bigger 600-page plus classics, I find myself I read maybe quarterly, kind of how I did Count of Monte Cristo previously. I'm reading it slowly in the background. I have a physical copy and an old copy on my Kindle. I read a good chunk of, probably like a quarter of it, while on the Tour de Mont Blanc, and that just sort of got me back into it, and now I've picked it back up in August. So really loving that. Those are the 9 books I read in June. You can see it's a very green orange stack, and really pretty strong month. Okay, now we're gonna jump into July. July, unlike the green and orange month, is a very blue month. This is almost all women in translation. There is 1 nonfiction that is written in English, and then 1 classic that's written in English. Everything else is translated. The first book of this month. This book I spent months trying to acquire. This is no longer in print. It's from Europa Editions. I had to search high and low on the internet. I found an old used library copy for $60 on Thrift Books, like 60 USD. I decided to bite the bullet and ordered it to Canada, paid the duties and shipping and all that, because I really wanted to read it on my travels to Greece. The book is The Jasmine Isle. So this was published in, I want to say 2005. I won't lie, this is not my favorite book I ever read, despite the lengths I went to acquire it. Greek names combined with the sort of stylistically confusing perspectives and dialogue made this a very difficult book to follow. Of an overarching multi-decade epic of a family. I did learn a lot about 20th century Greece and sort of their seafaring ways and the implications that has on love and family, particularly in the Isles. I did thoroughly enjoy the challenge of trying to acquire this and reading it. I was so glad I could read something like this while I was on my favorite Greek island of all time, Milos, and a new island, Foligandros. So what a treat that was to be able to read it there. I would love to see the newer translation, maybe that's a bit more streamlined in the English language, as this was so difficult to follow. Not to say I don't like a challenging read, just this was at times very confusing. So that was my first Greek read ever, which was very exciting. Forgot to mention, before I go to my second Greek read, I read my first Simone de Beauvoir, and I read this in Geneva, so in the French part of Switzerland. This is a French translated fiction. Simone has written some pretty popular books, none of which I've ever read before. This is just a beautifully written, short, feminist piece of classic literature. It's about womanhood and parents and children and their relationship dynamics. This is such an epitome of I picked it up for the cover at Daunt and I stayed for the text. I really enjoyed her introspective prose. I think it lingered with me and sat with me for a long time. I really enjoyed the way she writes about womanhood. And I think despite the fact that this was written over 50 years ago, it's still as nuanced and prevalent today as it was in the past. So I'm really glad I picked that up. Going back to the Greek literature, I have a classic that I had picked up here, a New York Review edition. Accidentally left it on my shelves, but was so desperate to read it, I picked up another copy when I was in the UK. This is Three Summers by Margarita Liberacki. I've seen quite a few friends also pick it up this summer. I think they're really pushing this edition in the UK. And I mean, it is gorgeous, but also the New York Review one is stunning too, so. Now I have two, and this is set just in the outskirts. This is not set on the Greek islands. This is set just on the outskirts of Athens, and it follows three sisters throughout multiple summers as they fall in love and fall out of love and sort of their relationship dynamics with their mother, their aunt, themselves, and their neighbors. This is set right before the Second World War. I really enjoyed this, actually. I found it much more accessible compared to The Jasmine Isle, which I had just previously read, which was very, very dense. And so I could see how this classic is much more accessible to the modern reader. This book was written immediately after World War II in 1946, so just some of the text is very interesting to read. It does talk about Palestine, which was a very interesting perspective from a Greek author. Yeah, I thought this was an accessible summer read and a pretty solid classic, so I would recommend picking this up if you're looking for one, particularly if you're traveling to Greece. The thing I find about Greek books is there's so many books set in Greece by English authors or written in English, particularly off the top of my head, I'm thinking of like Rachel Cusk, for example, and I'm sure there's lots of rom-coms and other books out there, but I think it's so important to read books written by Greek authors, translated from Greek, and so that's why I'm so glad I picked these up. From there, I jumped into my nonfiction of the month, which is Deborah Levy's Things I Don't Want to Know. This tiny little memoir is a cast of vignettes from her time growing up in South Africa and in London, to present day, or when she wrote this, in Spain, in Mallorca. And I really enjoyed reading this. This is my first time reading Deborah Levy, and I thoroughly enjoy her nonfiction. I've heard pretty mixed reviews about her fiction work, but I absolutely fell in love with this as a nonfiction piece. I think going into this, I anticipated sort of a Joan Didion cool girl essay style collection, but this is a much more poignant and engrossing collection of memories, I guess. Her discussions on immigration, particularly going from South Africa to England, and apartheid, was just deeply frank and honest, and I really appreciated her point of view, and I found it really interesting to learn from. Reading about her father and her mother during that time, how she felt moving to England. I don't know, I found this very, very interesting, and I really enjoyed her style of writing. So I would certainly recommend this to read. I definitely want to read the other two books in this trio of memoirs. They're very short. I could read hundreds of slices of her life. She's very interesting to read, and I'm sure to listen to, so. And now I'm intrigued to read her fiction. I read Deborah Levy while I was in Croatia. I didn't read any new Croatian literature this year. I read Slanting Towards the Sea last year, which I highly recommend if you're looking for a summer fiction read. It wasn't translated, but it is written by a Croatian author, so I thoroughly enjoyed that. However, after Croatia, we hopped over to Italy, where I had many Italian books here with me. One of them is a classic, is just set in Italy. It's not by an Italian author, and then 3 are Europa editions. So the first 2 out of 4 books I read was while I was in Kamoli, and this is by no less than Elena Ferrante. So I first read The Days of Abandonment, and then I read The Lost Daughter. I've previously read The Neapolitan Quartet, so I kind of knew what I was getting into, and just simply, I don't think anyone can capture the true psyche of motherhood and womanhood quite like Elena, and the internalized rage and anxiety of a mother. She does this so well, and she encapsulates their rage just phenomenally. I think, but these are very, very similar reads, actually. I think I do prefer The Lost Daughter over The Days of Abandonment. They're both great. I believe these are both written before The Neapolitan Quartet, and so I really love how you can see their influence on her later works, whether it's names or behaviors or plot points. It was very reminiscent of those books. They are slightly different, but they both feature mothers who are sort of spiraling in their own psyche, and gorgeous. Absolutely loved. It was such a Europa summer for sure. Definitely check them out. These are also very short in comparison to, you can see her Neapolitan Quartet over here. So these are very, very quick reads, easy beach reads. 2 more books to go. My next one I'll do is the classic I have. So this is not translated from Italian at all. This is from an English author. This is The Enchanted April by Elizabeth von Arnim. It's set in the Italian Riviera in the 1920s. I think it is set in Portofino. I don't remember actually, but regardless, it's set on the Italian coast. And this was such a gorgeously written novel. It kind of is reminiscent of A Month in the Country, just the way it's written and the way people interact. The behaviors of the women, just keeping their cool, and they're very admirable people, and I respect it. And this was sort of just like a joy to read. Like, there's not too much happening in it, but they're just good people, and I'm glad they got to finally take a vacation. And the last book of July was my favorite book of July. I really enjoyed them all, but nothing really stood out to me as like a stark 5-star read until this final book. This is a debut for 2026, so put this up there as a favorite debut alongside the artist. And this is translated from Italian, and this is Tangerine by Emanuela Anichum. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Again, a Europa edition. I read 4 Europa editions in July. They're just perfect for the Mediterranean. I can't help it. This was just such a beautiful novel. The protagonist lives in London, and she goes back to southern Italy when her father passes away. And the way that this is written, this style of writing, a lot of people might not like, just the way of the perspective. However, I found it really worked for this book. The discussions on family and migration and finding your identity and finding where you belong, because there's so many versions of migrants in this story. It's so interesting to read about. I just really love this. From London to Morocco to southern Italy, this was just a very beautiful and interesting read, and I found it very fascinating, and the way it battles with grief and humor and family dynamics and identifying with your heritage and where you live. I don't know. It's a 5-star read for sure. I thoroughly recommend. What a debut. Stunning. These are all the books I read in June and July. I hope you like this video. Let me know if you read any of these books, which ones you would recommend. And I look forward to filming the next video and hopefully editing some vlogs.